Vivian.
Hey, Faye.
So, I've heard you've been traveling a bit recently. What's been good on the road?
It's been real tasty. One of the things I've eaten in Texas is a lot more queso, which is basically melted cheese dip.
Oh man, that sounds so good right now on this cold summer day in SF.
Yeah, definitely. But one thing that's been bothering me is how this seems to generate waste. They usually put this like delightful queso goop in a disposable paper cup, which I'm not totally sure if I can compost that. What do you think?
Are these queso cups like small disposable coffee cups?
Yeah, kind of. A little bit shorter and a little bit wider.
Well, I've always put disposable coffee cups in the compost if I can find a bin, but
Mm.
to be honest, I'm not sure. Let's talk to an expert.
Hi, and welcome to the Keeping It Cool podcast. I'm Yifei Huang.
And I'm Vivian Patterson.
Every episode, we surface stories about how individuals in our Bay Area communities are contributing to climate action.
To get started, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and Rethink Waste?
Sure. My name is Julia Au. I'm the Senior Outreach, Education, and Compliance Manager at RethinkWaste, which basically means I oversee all the public education and outreach programs that we do, which range from educating residents and businesses and students in schools. And then also compliance, which is basically making sure we're compliant with state laws and local regulations. Rethink Waste, also known as South Bayside Waste Management Authority, which is a mouthful, which is why we go by Rethink Waste. We represent 11 member agencies. So those are cities, the county, and then a sanitary district. We cover Burlingame all the way to East Palo Alto, east of 280 is our service areas.
And what kinds of services does Rethink Waste provide in this area?
We oversee the waste management services. And we also own and manage the 16-acre site, the Shoreway Environmental Center in San Carlos. It's the location where we process all the recyclables, trash, and compostable materials collected in our service area. And because we're a public agency, our site is publicly owned. So if you live in our service area, you kind of own it, I guess. And we work closely with two main contractors, Recology San Mateo County, who a lot of people know because they are our waste hauler. They're the ones out in the trucks picking up your recycling, composting, and garbage from residents and businesses, and they bring that to our facility. And then South Bay Recycling, who a lot of people don't know, they're the behind the scenes people because they're the ones operating our facility.
Let's talk about your work managing the facility. What kinds of things happen at the San Carlos Environmental Center?
Shoreway Environmental Center is a transfer station. So we process almost 500,000 tons of materials annually. And then we also have a materials recovery facility, which is where all the recyclables go. In that facility, it sorts the materials by type. So like between plastics and metals and paper and all that stuff. For the garbage, no one actually touches it. It doesn't get sorted and it goes straight to Ox Mountain landfill, which is where we send our landfill materials. And then for the compost, it also doesn't get sorted. For our service area, we contract with two locations to send our organic materials. And one is Blossom Valley Organics North in Vernalis, which is like Central Valley. That's owned by Recology. And then the other side is Newbie Island, which is owned by Republic Services. And I believe that's in like San Jose area.
How did you spell the second one?
That's Wendy, another producer on our podcast.
Newbie Island?
Yeah.
Newby.
I was thinking it might end in IE, and I was like, oh, that's
No.
like kind of cute. Like, yeah,
No.
Yeah. So one is in San Jose. You said the other one's in Central Valley. That one feels like it's really far away.
Yes.
Obviously, it's nice to have extra space out in Central Valley. I assume that these haulers are still using like diesel or natural gas.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if there's a break-even point between putting it in a landfill that's closer versus getting it to a composting facility that's much further.
That's a good question. We produce so much organics in our service area. We cover 430,000 residents, and we have like almost 11,000 businesses, which includes apartment buildings. So that's a lot. As the state is looking towards composting more and not just yard waste, but food scrap composting, we need more infrastructure. 2 years ago, we actually had to go out to bid for a new organics contract. And I want to say it was like twice as much as we were paying before, which to the public is like, well, why would you pay so much to compost stuff if it's cheaper to like landfill stuff? Ox Mountain landfill, there's only one active landfill in San Mateo County. And it has anywhere between, 15 to 19 years left. And once we run out of that space, which is going to be in our lifetime, we're going to have to truck that landfill material like further and further away. Same thing, like a couple of years ago, we also went out to bid for a contract for where to send our landfill materials. And those places are so far. Half Moon Bay is pretty close. We want to make that landfill last as long as possible so we don't have to truck it further, because then those costs will be more. And then we pass those costs on to our ratepayers. And that's just not worth it. It was a big hit. It was kind of a shock to our board. So to me, it's just balancing that out between where we're sending all of our materials, not just organics. There's cost and benefits for the whole system, not just, focusing on one stream.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. I hadn't really thought of it. Like you said, it's a system, and once the landfill is full, you're going to have to truck that stuff out far away anyway. So yeah, that completely makes sense to me.
And on the educational side, it's like, well, we don't want to send stuff to landfill, right? Because we know that organic materials makes up, a big chunk of the landfill materials and releases methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. We want people to do the right thing.
So for those of you who have not listened to our previous episodes, just as a recap, methane is 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere. When organic materials such as food waste decompose in the presence of oxygen, they release CO2. While we don't like CO2, if they decompose in a landfill where they're buried and don't have access to oxygen, they actually release methane instead, which is way worse.
Right. So this means that throwing your food in the landfill is 25 times worse than throwing your food in the compost bin.
Exactly. To figure out more about composting, Vivian and Wendy asked Julia how industrial composting works.
So once the food scraps, yard trimming, sold paper, all the stuff that we accept in our compost bin goes to the facility, it usually goes through a screening process to eliminate some of the contamination. Plastics and glass are often found in your green cart, compost cart, or bin. And although it does go through a screening process, it doesn't capture everything. So to me, it's really important to obviously put the correct things into your compost cart and bin. And then it usually takes, I think, like 60 to 120 days for it to break down in that system. Those processes are not perfect, just like our recycling process isn't perfect. So to me, it's like sort properly so we don't get all that contamination in there. The finished compost, some of it comes back to us. We actually have a compost giveaway at the Shoreway facility. So for people who live in our service area, you can come and get finished compost. For the rest of the compost that they finish, a lot of it goes back to like farms somewhere in California. So it is a nice closed loop system, I guess.
Yeah, that's really cool. You actually answered one of our questions of like, oh yeah, like what happens to the compost? But it's cool that your residents can pick up compost. Like, I think that's really nice. And they can actually see the finished product,
Yeah, I love walking by that pile of compost in the transfer station, and people, they can pick up, I think, 2 bags, 50 pounds each, I think, which is a lot.
That's cool. Actually, we recently looked into the system because Vidya's apartment complex, which is in Santa Clara, only has a single bin for everything. Mm-hmm. And after a little bit of digging, it turns out they do single stream waste. So, just put everything in the garbage bin and it will get sorted downstream.
Yep.
But it kind of sounds like the majority of the Bay Area uses the 3-bin system. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of curious what your take is on single stream versus these 3 bins where people might sort improperly.
Yeah. I feel like having the separate bins is great because it forces the person to kind of think about where stuff goes. Having people actually sort the materials themselves, I feel like has a greater impact. especially when they come on a tour too, they can see it. It's like, oh, this is why we should compost, because look at that giant pile of garbage over there. And look how much in it is food. Like you can see some of the food stuff in there. So I feel like that impact is really important. So I personally like the 3-cart system just because I think it's a good way to educate people about why it's important to recycle, why it's important to compost, and then keep that landfill cart as small as possible.
Do you know how much industrial composting is diverting from landfill?
1383 is a bill that was signed into law by the governor back in, I think, 2016, which is aimed to reduce climate pollutants, one of which is methane. So methane being a potent greenhouse gas, and methane emissions, I think, from the US is like 15% from landfills. But it's a statewide effort to reduce, methane. We're supposed to get 50% diversion by 2020, which was 2 years ago, and then 75% diversion by 2025. In our service area, we've been composting for 10 years, but now that 1383 is in effect, it's going to be mandatory. So everyone's going to have to recycle their food waste or food scraps and stuff like that. And in some cities like San Francisco has had mandatory since like 2009 for mandatory organics recycling. And I also think the Bay Area as a whole, we've all been kind of used to composting. A lot of us have had food waste composting for a long time, which is great because we have these systems in place, but a lot of the state does not. Like I know Sacramento and LA, they don't have composting. I mean, they have a green bin where you can put your yard trimmings, but they haven't done food waste composting. And setting up those systems and educating those residents and businesses is a huge undertaking. So, whatever the numbers are now, how much we're diverting, it's going to be more, right? I think those impacts, we haven't seen the true impacts of that system, but it's such a nice closed loop system. You're eating food, growing things, and then kind of putting it back into the earth eventually, right? I think that's kind of cool.
It sounds like you're pretty excited about the Senate Bill 1383.
I mean, I'm excited to the point that I think it's a great thing. I started at RethinkWaste after the bill was passed and signed into law. We definitely support it because it's helping us talk about climate change as it relates to waste. It's a very tangible thing for a lot of people. Like when we talk about climate change, like 10, 20 years ago, everyone's like, I can't buy like a fuel efficient car. Like I can't do all these things. But to me, it's like, everyone can compost. Like we all have to eat. We all have food scraps. And I think it's a very tangible thing that people can kind of see. And I think that's really cool. Another part of 1383 is to rescue at least 20% of the currently disposed of edible food for human consumption by 2025, which I think is actually the coolest thing about 1383 because, it's not just about composting, but it's trying to capture that food that while you can send that to composting, and I know in the last podcast I listened to about food waste, it's great, but we don't want it to go to waste in the first place. So you think about the grocery stores, big restaurants or industrial kitchens, they always have leftover food. And if we can capture a lot of that food and give it to people in need, I think that's a great thing. So I actually think the edible food thing is probably the most unique thing about 1383.
Yeah, that's super awesome. And what do you think is the hardest part of this process?
The education part is always the hardest part. As I think you all know, like outreach and education takes years. To change people's behaviors doesn't happen overnight. It took us 10 years to remember to bring our own bag. Now we're going to have to try to get people to separate, like put your food trimmings in the garbage, put them in the compost, and try not to contaminate, take off that produce sticker, stuff like that. So
actually, this is an excellent shill. One of the questions we had is what are things that individuals can do to make this process easier? You've talked about a lot of long-term things, but also these small tips and tricks like take the sticker off the produce is something that I didn't know until pretty recently. I don't know if you have either broad or specific tips for people composting at home.
One of my first campaigns when I started here was actually a compost campaign because we hadn't really educated residents. We tried to learn what people knew and what they didn't. A lot of people did not know to take off that produce sticker. It's plastic. Don't put that in the compost. And to me, I think the best education for everyone is to find out. We like to say like, when in doubt, throw it out. But we actually like, when in doubt, find out.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, I might have stolen that from ecology, but to me, it's that education part. A lot of us have a smartphone. We can look stuff up. One of our programs is putting up signage in public spaces. We have some parks that have composting, and it's like, well, we have signage there. It tells you what goes in there and what doesn't. So look at the sign. And I think that's the easiest thing. You might have a kitchen compost pail. Recology gives out kitchen compost pails to all residents who have organic services. And there's a sticker on the front, easy pictures. You don't have to know English. And if it doesn't, you should ask Recology for one. And that's actually something cool. I'm going to go on a tangent about 1383. It has a lot of regulations, but one of the things in it was actually to standardize cart colors and to require signage on all of our carts. You might not know, and I don't know where you're all from, but in LA, the cart colors are not the same as ours. Or even in the East Bay, like I know some people have brown garbage carts and then black recycling. And it's like, nope, the state's going to require green to be compost, blue is recycling, and either black or gray as your garbage, and then have signage on them. And it is a huge cost. Like to switch out carts are like hundreds of dollars. It's not cheap, but I think that's a huge thing for the state, standardizing colors and just having signage available. So to me, signage is always the biggest thing. Like look for signs and just to find out what goes in there.
What are things that people most often put in the compost bin that they shouldn't?
Produce stickers, plastic bags, and glass are often the most contaminated things we find in compost bins, or like wrapping. People have leftover food in a clamshell and they just think, well, it has food in it, I'm just going to throw the whole thing in the compost. And it's like, well, no, you got to open it, maybe toss that outside packaging part. So we have a good website. rethinkcompost.org is our campaign website, and has some great tips and tricks on there to remind people, like, remember to peel that sticker off. Remember to not contaminate your compost cart with bags and stuff like that. So there's a lot of materials out there that people can look up. I know Recology has a website called whatbin.com to know what goes in what cart. We also have a fun sorting game on our website. And I think, the more we learn, the more we can, educate ourselves, but also educate our family and friends too. But yeah, I like the when in doubt, find out. That's my new slogan.
So would that information be different for every city or county? I'm worried that what applies to me in Millbrae might not apply to, say, Ife, who lives in San Francisco. And there are so many organizations like Recology, Rethink Waste. What's the best way to figure out what applies to me?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, if you have carts or bins in wherever you live and there is signage, go look up either the city you live in or the garbage company that you have. Usually both of those sites will have most of that information. So to me, it's like most people know what city they live in. They might not know what garbage company they have, but most cities have information on their websites about what goes where. And if not, it links back to whoever their hauler is. So I think it's really important just to Google your city and then recycling or composting, and usually something will pop up. But I know people get confused. I mean, people email us from other cities in the county saying, how can I get free compost? Or how do I know more information? It's like, you don't live on our service area, so you should go here. And I think that's the hardest part. I wish there was one big system we are all a part of, but we're not. And having worked in different counties, it is really confusing. And I think if we're confused, I can't imagine how a resident is.
I've definitely been in some jurisdictions where they have like a really nice search tool even. I used to live in Millbrae, and you could go to South Bay Scavenger and you could type in, this is the thing I want to get rid of. Where do I put it? And it'll tell you. But there's definitely a couple of things that don't show up and are kind of confusing. But I don't know if you want to play this lightning round of, can I put this in an industrial compost? And no need to speak for any particular jurisdiction, but Rethink Waste. Things that we are often confused about that don't show up on the search tool are like butter wrappers, parchment or wax paper, or bakery wrappers. I'm always like, I don't know. It kind of feels like paper.
Yeah, I say that is compost. It's usually paper or it's like wax. What I like to do with my butter wrappers, because there's usually like some butter left on it, I actually freeze them And then when I need to like butter a pan, I just take that wrapper out of the freezer and I just use that to butter the pan because it's usually enough to butter something that I'm baking, and I bake a lot. But then I compost it. But yeah, as long as it's truly paper, and usually you can tell if it's paper, it should be easy to rip. So parchment paper, wax paper, those bakery things that your bread comes in, that can definitely go in.
That's perfect. That's so great to know. What about to-go boxes that are maybe paper? This one's hard because there's so many different ones. Often on the compost bin, you see a Chinese takeout box, and I like feel it, and I'm like,
I feel like, if it's truly fiber-based, so if it's paper and you can rip it, it's probably okay to put in the compost. I usually do the rip test with a lot of things just to make sure. Or even like it says it's compostable or biodegradable. If it just feels like hard plastic, I'm like, no, that's garbage. I think, especially in the last like 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot of products come out saying like, I'm biodegradable, I'm compostable. There is a certification, a BPI, and the new BPI, I think they also test for like PFAS and stuff. So I think to me, it's like, if it feels like plastic and you're like, but it says it's compostable, it's probably not. So I would check that, including like utensils that say they're biodegradable.
Whoa, wait, hold up. Lot of acronyms here. BPI? What's that?
yeah, that's a good point. BPI stands for Biodegradable Products Institute. So they're an institute that tests and certifies materials that successfully breaks down in industrial compost within a certain amount of time and without harming the quality of the finished compost.
Oh, cool. I see.
Yeah, and also BPI approved products say BPI compostable on them, and they also have a little swirly logo on them for easy identification. You can find a photo of this logo on their website, which will be linked in our show notes.
Woo.
And Julia talks about how BPI shows up on many items, including biodegradable bags.
I feel like bags, BPI bags especially, they're very thin. And I mean, they definitely have a stamp on them. For to-go boxes, I feel like, if you truly feel like it's fiber-based, I will put that in the compost. And then I will make one last plug is recently San Mateo County Office of Sustainability, they've been working on a disposable foodware ordinance, passed it a couple years ago, and a couple of our member agencies have adopted the county's ordinance by reference. And the big part of it is to move away from that compostable plastic stuff to just fiber-based packaging for restaurants. Mm-hmm. And I think that's great. We haven't gotten all our member agencies to adopt it, but as we do, we'll see less and less of those materials that are not actually compostable. So I'm kind of excited about that.
Hey, Julia, do you have an opinion about these drinkware? I mean, like beverage cups that say they're compostable, and you might find them at like a juice place or something. And are these actually compostable? Because these are hard.
It takes more than that 60 to 120 days for stuff like that to break down in the facility. So to me, it's best to stay clear from those, bring your own cup, mug, whatever, water bottle, and just try to avoid stuff. I personally think it's a lot of greenwashing. It's great that we can make materials from others, but once you recycle something plastic once, which is basically what is happening, it's hard to recycle that next thing. Just because my vest is made out of recycled water bottles doesn't mean I can recycle my vest. To me, that's similar to these materials. It might be made out of something that's compostable at some point, but now I feel like, it might have been mixed with other things. And to me, that BPI certification is really important. I often don't see those in those kind of cups, but I have to say, Wendy, I was like, we saw those at the Rotary event a couple weeks ago, and I was like, no. So
Yeah, so it's like the cups and the forks and spoons. Those are the worst.
yeah, definitely the forks and spoon, like all of those should just go in the garbage, but everyone should just bring their own. So
Yeah.
Right. Okay, that's new information to me. It makes sense that they would be more difficult to break down even in an industrial composting facility.
The funny thing about compostable forks, not really compostable forks and spoons, is I actually put them in the dishwasher and they go through totally fine, like normal, like. So I actually reuse them
Oh
sometimes.
yeah, that's concerning.
Yeah, but it's
Yeah.
terrible.
But I guess this is a bit of a tangent. Does this mean you should just buy Like, I hear that they're more difficult to make, and if they're going into landfill anyway, should you just buy normal? If you're going to buy a disposable thing, should it just be a plastic thing?
Yeah, at the end of the day, I would try to avoid them at all costs. One of our giveaway items that are very popular is a set of reusable metal utensils. And the governor signed a bill last year to basically make it so that, for to-go orders, you have to ask for the single-use stuff before. You can't just automatically get it, which I think is also a great thing because people just automatically expect to get stuff. I know my parents are like, how come I didn't get the utensils? I'm like, you're eating at home. Like, you don't need utensils. You don't even need napkins, and you don't need the little packages of ketchup or soy sauce because you probably have that at home. And that stuff I just kind of throw in my car just in case I forget my utensils or my friend forgets them. So I use them. So I definitely don't throw them out just because I got them. But I don't have an answer to your question, but
Totally fine.
Wow, Vivian. Okay, you guys unpacked a lot of stuff there. Maybe to summarize, you talked about doing a rip test for things that feel like paper or fiber. If it feels like plastic, probably not compostable.
Mm-hmm.
And also looking for this BPI certification, which makes me wonder if I have a hard plastic cup that says it's BPI approved, does that mean I should be composting it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One, if you know that the cup is BPI certified, and two, if the jurisdiction that you're in is able to handle it in industrial compost, then you can absolutely compost it. So you need both of these to be true. If not, it's just trash.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. So for BPI certification, we talked about looking for a logo, but how would I go about figuring out if my jurisdiction can take BPI certified items that feel like plastic?
Yeah, this one is a little bit trickier. Most jurisdictions have a search tool where you can actually find out what bin you should put various items. So, for example, Recology has a search tool that is aptly called What Bin that is actually specific to different parts of the Bay Area. So, for example, Recology SF says that compostable plastics that are BPI certified can go in the compost bin, but Recology San Mateo says to put that in the landfill bin.
Oh.
Again, this is because different facilities have different processes. So, like Julia said before, it's actually just the simplest and best to avoid using single-use items as much as possible.
That makes sense. Wow. So it really depends on where you live.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm happy that there's a tool that we could all use to look that up. And maybe now I'm curious about that queso cup we talked about earlier. Is that actually compostable?
The queso cup. Using the search tool that corresponds to my specific address. This tool, if you type in paper cup, it will give you the response that if the paper cup is lined with plastic, then it must be placed in the landfill. And so when I checked it out earlier, it did feel like a paper cup on the outside, but on the inside, when I ran my finger along the edge, it was pretty clearly lined with something that I couldn't scratch off with my nail. It was probably plastic. So unfortunately, I had to put it in the landfill.
Oh, sad. R.I.P. queso cup.
All right, I have a couple more. I know we're kind of
Yeah.
running up. Animal waste. I generally see that you don't want to put that in industrial compost.
No, that's a great question. We get that question a lot. Yeah, no animal waste. Our facilities don't take them. It's not that animal waste isn't compostable. We like to say it's like an ick factor. Pet waste has certain different bacteria and stuff in it.
Right.
Just don't want it. So even if you put it in a compostable bag, it still goes in the garbage.
Makes sense. What about used tissues to blow your nose?
So same thing with the ick factor. So if it used for human waste, like blowing your nose or something, no. But it's okay if you use a tissue to wipe down food or liquids or something like that. Like paper towels are okay. As long as you didn't use it to blow your nose, then you're fine.
Last two, I think. Milk cartons, like the paper milk cartons with the lining, and I guess similarly ice cream cartons. Are those compostable?
Yeah, so same thing with the rip test. A lot of those things are lined with plastic.
Yeah.
In our service area, we actually tell, especially at schools that have the milk cartons for the students, they can be, if they're clean and empty, they can go in the recycling actually. But most milk cartons, if you feel like you can rip it, maybe you can throw it in the compost. And obviously the plastic ones, those can go in the recycling.
Right. Okay, cool. And I think my last one is compostable bags. Are those actually compostable?
As long as it has the BPI certification on it, those can definitely still go into your compost.
Gotcha. Okay. Wow, thank you so much. Do you know if composting is better than jamming stuff down your sink disposal?
That's a good question. We actually had someone ask that question like maybe a year or two ago, and we kind of went through a rabbit hole of looking it up. I think putting material into a compost bin is way better. Wastewater treatment plants, they just can't process stuff the certain way. It takes a lot of energy too to process that through a whole plant. If you want to make sure it gets composted, then you should put it in your compost bin.
Awesome. I think that's all of our items. Thank you so much for playing the What Bin game in real time with us. It would be super cool to actually see the compost at the facility in action someday.
We do tours of our facility. Have you been on a tour?
I have not, but I'm going to put it on my list because I hear it's like really interesting.
We just had a couple public tours last weekend and people ask amazing questions. Our virtual tours are great, but it's hard to, you don't smell and hear everything the same way as you're in person. I think just seeing that process really opens people's eyes.
Yeah.
We're happy to take you on a tour.
Oh, that's so cool.
Oh, my boss would love it.
Yeah.
In general, when you look to the future, I'm wondering if you feel that we have been making progress. I mean, obviously we have these new mandates with 1383, but separate from all that, do you think that the message is getting through to people?
Just based on the amount of questions we get and people who come out on tours and people who email us, I think people are definitely getting, especially the link between composting and climate change and just sorting properly. I bring it back to bringing your own bag to the store. It's a slow change. Behavior change don't happen overnight. We are seeing that change, but it's very slow. But I feel really satisfied as an educator and doing outreach all these years when people tell me like, I did not know that I should take that produce sticker off my compost, or I don't know what goes where. And now I know. It definitely warms my heart. And I want whatever you learn today and what other people learn from us on a day-to-day basis to share that with their friends and family, because that's the best kind of outreach.
Yeah, I love that word of mouth. I personally today learned that just because you're composting doesn't mean that that's the end of the story, because you just described how you have to pay for this new site that's like so far away. So it helps to reduce how much you're composting as well as how much you're landfilling.
Yeah. The first R is reduce, right? So
Right.
People forget it though. It's definitely the hardest one.
yeah.
I learned today that even though the state has passed 1383, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to implement it across the state.
Yeah. 1383 is a beast, as I like to say. I think the last couple of years I haven't gone a day without talking about 1383. It's something that really matters to a lot of people. Like yesterday at our webinar, someone was talking about how, we talk about the future generations, but also we are future ancestors. So what did we do? And it's like, when we started mandatory composting, I think that's something important is like, it's slow, but we're moving in the right direction.
I think you definitely answered all of our questions that we've listed. I feel like I have like even more questions of like, why do we have so many compostable plastic things that everyone thinks is fine? Anyway, that's like a whole different thing.
Education is key. That's part of my job. Trying to educate people, it's a lot.
Yeah.
For the people who care, they'll look it up. And for the people who don't, those are the people that we'll try to work on. And we won't get through to everybody, but we'll try our best. So
yeah,
at all levels.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was so
Sure.
informative and fun and pretty uplifting, I think.
I try to stay positive. We got to be hopeful. And I'm very hopeful of what I've seen, especially in the last couple years.
You can find the resources mentioned in this episode linked on our website's show notes. This includes the What Bin search tool, the BPI website and logo, and much more information. Thank you to Julia Au, who explained how the industrial composting process works and taught us how to figure out what's compostable and what isn't.
Thank you to Stephanie Lai, who designed our logo, and Deep Talk for the original music. And lastly, this wouldn't be possible without our wonderful team here at the Keeping It Cool podcast. That's Vivian Patterson, Wendy Cho, Vidya Ravi, and me, Yifei Huang. Stay tuned for our next episode.